A low fog clings to the Arctic horizon, blurring the boundary between sky and sea. The wind cuts like glass, dry and thin, screaming through the rigging of a convoy spread across 30 miles of ice-cold ocean. It is July 4th, 1942. Midnight sun glowing pale against the clouds. Yet it feels like the end of the world. Every man on deck knows that survival out here is measured not in courage, but in minutes. Ice has crusted over the railings, and the spray that hits their faces freezes before it can fall. Somewhere within that fog, unseen beneath the waves, German U-boats wait like wolves in the dark. On the bridge of the Empire Tide, an officer rubs his hands together, trying to keep them warm enough to turn the dials on the radio. He's waiting for a signal, any sign from the escorting warships that the way ahead is clear. Instead, a burst of static hisses through the receiver, followed by 5 words that none of them believe at first. Convoy is to scatter. The words hang in the air like a death sentence. To scatter here, hundreds of miles from land, means to die alone. Around the fleet, captains lift binoculars in disbelief. The destroyers are already turning away, their shapes fading into the mist. The protection they depended on, the wall of steel between them and the enemy, is leaving. Some men curse. Others stand in silence, listening to the ice groan against the hull. The sea is calm, almost too calm, as if waiting for what comes next. War has been fought in deserts, in jungles, in cities, but never in a place like this. The Arctic kills without malice, without warning. One wrong decision here is fatal, and this decision, made not by the enemy, but by their own command, will become one of the most catastrophic orders in naval history. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next, because by the end of this story, you'll understand how an order sent across the coldest sea on Earth turned a lifeline into a graveyard, and why 35 ships went north, but only 11 came back. The men of Convoy PQ-17 were not adventurers or soldiers by choice. Many were civilian sailors, Americans, British, Norwegians, hauling the cargo that kept Stalin's front alive. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, fuel, even tinned meat, all lashed to the decks and sealed beneath frost. Each ship was a floating warehouse, worth its weight in survival. If they reached Murmansk, it could change the balance of the Eastern Front. If they didn't, the Red Army would fight its next battles, hungry and half-armed. They understood what was at stake. They just didn't understand why their protectors had left them. On board the Daniel Morgan, a 22-year-old gunner watches the escort ships vanish behind a curtain of fog. He writes one line in his diary: "They say the Germans are coming." He doesn't know yet that the German battleship Tirpitz, the most feared vessel in the Atlantic, hasn't actually moved. The Admiralty, misreading scattered intelligence and radio deception, believed she was steaming north from Norway to annihilate the convoy. The order to scatter was supposed to save them. Instead, it delivered them into isolation. That night, the convoy unravels across the Barents Sea. Ships that had been bound together by formation and discipline now drift apart, small and slow, prey against an infinite horizon. The ocean is too quiet, the sky too bright. It's the strange, perpetual light of the Arctic summer. No darkness to hide in, only exposure. Every whitecap could be a periscope. Every cloud bank could hide bombers. The men can't sleep. The cold is too sharp and the fear too loud. In London, First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound sits over his desk, exhausted. He's been awake for nearly 30 hours, running on reports that warn of Tirpitz mobilizing. The shadow of that ship has haunted Allied commanders for months, an obsession that warps judgment. Pound doesn't yet realize that his single signal, sent through static and frostbite, has condemned a convoy that will take 3 more days to die. By dawn, the ships are already scattering beyond sight of one another. The Paulus Potter veers west, River Afton holds north, Winston-Salem drifts east. Each captain calculates a course he hopes will stay clear of submarines, but there's no safe route. Only empty, freezing sea. Men chip ice off the gun barrels to keep them from freezing solid. Some pray. Some make jokes they don't believe in. The temperature drops below 0. The decks creak under the weight of frozen spray. And then, in the distance, the first explosions roll across the water. At 4:10, the German Wolfpack Eisteufel, Ice Devil, makes contact. Torpedoes streak beneath the waves, invisible until the moment they strike. A flash, a roar, and a column of fire where a ship had been. The men on neighboring vessels watch helplessly as the sea blooms orange, then black. They can hear the cries, short, sharp, swallowed by the wind. A gunner aboard the Samuel Chase writes later, "The ocean looked alive. You couldn't tell the difference between men and debris." Within hours, Luftwaffe bombers take over where the U-boats leave off. Ju-88s sweep down from Norway, their engines echoing across the empty sky. Without escorts, the merchant ships have nothing but a few deck guns and courage. The Arctic amplifies every sound. The whine of a diving plane feels endless. One ship after another burns, the smoke trailing for miles across the ice field. By the end of the second day, PQ-17 is no longer a convoy. It's a graveyard spread over 500 miles of ocean. Back in Britain, the radio reports grow grim. The Admiralty's map of the Arctic, once dotted with dozens of positions, now shows only a few faint signals. Many of those are distress calls that end mid-transmission. Some ships try to regroup. Others keep running toward Murmansk, praying for Soviet air cover that never comes. The decision to scatter has done what no German fleet could achieve. It has destroyed an entire Allied convoy without a single major surface engagement. On July 10th, survivors from the Troubadour are picked up by a Soviet trawler. They've been adrift for 6 days, faces burned by cold and salt. Out of the convoy's 35 merchant ships, only 11 will make it to port. The rest sink silently, swallowed by ice and darkness. Their cargo, 153 aircraft, 430 tanks, over 100,000 tons of war material, lies beneath the Barents Sea still. In London, Admiral Pound whispers to an aide, "It was the most regrettable signal I ever made." He's right. The order to scatter will go down as one of the greatest blunders in British naval history, not because of malice, but because of fear. And in that fear, hundreds of sailors froze to death under a sun that never set. The Arctic convoys were born out of desperation. In 1941, when Hitler turned on his former ally and invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin demanded help from the West. He needed tanks, trucks, aircraft, and ammunition, anything that could keep the Red Army fighting on the Eastern Front. The only way to deliver that aid was by sea. The southern routes through the Mediterranean were blocked, and the long Pacific route was too slow. That left the top of the world, an uncharted corridor of ice and storm where the sun never set in summer and never rose in winter. It became known simply as the Arctic route. From British ports like Liverpool and Loch Ewe, convoys would sail north past Iceland, then east toward the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Each voyage took them through waters patrolled by German aircraft and submarines based in occupied Norway. For the men who sailed it, it was a journey into hell. The cold alone could kill. Temperatures dropped to -30, and seawater froze instantly on deck. Frostbite, snow blindness, and hypothermia were as lethal as any torpedo. Veterans later said they would rather face enemy fire in the tropics than one night in the Barents Sea. Convoy PQ-17 was one of these missions. 35 merchant ships carried the lifeblood of Stalin's war effort: 430 tanks, 153 aircraft, and tens of thousands of tons of ammunition, oil, and food. They were escorted by 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 2 anti-aircraft ships, and a covering force of 15 Royal Navy warships, including 2 heavy cruisers. It was a massive effort, American cargo under British protection, heading into Soviet waters. Every man aboard knew the stakes. If the supplies didn't arrive, Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front could collapse. Hitler's armies were already deep inside Russia, and the Allies could not afford for their only partner in Europe to fall. The conditions were unbearable from the start. Even in July, the Arctic Ocean offered no mercy. Ice formed on the rigging. Waves froze as they broke across the decks. The endless daylight disoriented the men. There was no night, only a dim twilight that made sleep impossible and hiding useless. The ships steamed in tight formation to protect one another, their wakes carving straight lines through the pale sea. Above them, the sky was an endless sheet of gray, heavy with snow that never fell. To the north, German reconnaissance planes from occupied Norway shadowed them, circling just beyond range. The men could see their silver wings flash in the distance. They knew that every sighting was reported back to the Luftwaffe, and that somewhere beyond the horizon, U-boats were taking their positions. The Germans had formed a wolf pack to intercept the convoy, codenamed Eisteufel, or Ice Devil. Each submarine carried torpedoes designed to detonate under a ship's keel, where the ice-cold steel was weakest. The men on the merchant ships were not trained for war. Most were civilian sailors, engineers, cooks, and deckhands pressed into military service. Their vessels were slow, heavy, and built for cargo, not combat. But they trusted the Royal Navy to guard them. They believed that as long as the escorts held the line, they would make it through. It was a fragile faith, built on discipline and routine. Every day, the convoy sailed in silence, engines humming, ice cracking against the hulls. Every night, or what passed for night, they stood at battle stations, watching for shadows that might be periscopes. On July 3rd, the danger escalated. British intelligence had intercepted radio traffic suggesting that the German battleship Tirpitz, the most powerful warship in Europe, was preparing to sail from Norway. The Tirpitz was Hitler's pride, a floating fortress armed with 8 15-inch guns and protected by the Luftwaffe. Even the rumor of her presence was enough to send fear through Allied command. Admiral Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord in London, believed that Tirpitz was heading straight for PQ-17. If she broke into the convoy, no escort could stop her. The entire mission could be wiped out in hours. But the signal was wrong. Tirpitz never left port. German orders were confused. The ship's crew was still refueling. Yet in London, the fear of losing another fleet like those at Norway or Crete loomed large. The Admiralty decided to act. Pound sent a message to Rear Admiral Hamilton, commander of the covering force, and Commodore Jack Broom, who led the close escort. The message was short, written in the clipped language of naval orders. It instructed the warships to withdraw west and the convoy to scatter east toward Russia. It was meant to save the warships from destruction by the German surface fleet, but it left the merchantmen alone, stripped of protection. At that moment, 1,200 miles from home, surrounded by fog and ice, PQ-17 ceased to be a convoy. The order to scatter meant each ship was on its own, free to choose its course and speed. Some captains refused to believe it. They radioed back asking for confirmation. The reply came, "Immediate. Proceed independently." Others broke formation at once, engines roaring as they tried to outrun a phantom enemy. The destroyers turned west as ordered, vanishing into the mist. The merchant ships pressed on, their navigation lights darkened, each one a solitary target on an endless white sea. For the men aboard, it felt like betrayal. One sailor later wrote in his journal, "We could still see the warships' wakes long after they left. It was like watching hope disappear." Another recalled that the silence after the last destroyer vanished was worse than the sound of bombs. They knew the Germans would come. It was only a matter of when. In the icy stillness that followed, the sea seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beneath the waves, the U-boats waited. The sky above, pale and endless, hid the glint of approaching wings. Convoy PQ-17 had scattered, and the hunt was about to begin. The convoy's enemy was not only the sea, it was also a shadow of fear that traveled ahead of it. The Germans called it Unternehmen Rösselsprung, Operation Knight's Move, a naval plan to strike Allied convoys heading to the Soviet Union. In Norway's fjords, vast concrete pens held the most dangerous weapon in the Arctic, the battleship Tirpitz. Her presence alone distorted Allied strategy. She was 42,000 tons of steel and superstition, her guns capable of turning any merchant convoy into scrap within minutes. To the Admiralty, Tirpitz was less a ship and more a curse. She didn't need to sail to win battles. She only needed to be rumored. At Trondheim and Narvik, Luftwaffe reconnaissance squadrons tracked PQ-17 from the moment it left Icelandic waters. Long-range Focke-Wulf Condor bombers prowled above the clouds, feeding constant updates to U-boat flotillas beneath the surface. Every Allied ship was being followed, plotted, and anticipated. To the north, along the Norwegian coast, submarine pens at Kirkenes and Tromsø prepared to release the Wolfpack Eisteufel, the Ice Devils. Their orders were simple: wait until the convoy was far from air cover, then attack relentlessly until nothing floated. Inside the Admiralty War Room in London, maps of the Arctic were updated hourly. Admiral Dudley Pound leaned over the plotting tables, his staff officers marking positions with colored pins that drifted farther east each day. Pound was 66, weary, and suffering from ill health, a man of immense experience but failing strength. As reports arrived warning of Tirpitz's possible movement, his mind filled the gaps with worst-case scenarios. The Royal Navy could not risk losing its cruisers. They were the backbone of Britain's sea power. To lose them would be to reopen the wounds of Norway in 1940. Caution took hold like frost spreading across a window pane. Meanwhile, on the water, Commodore Jack Broom commanded the close escort. Broom was a seasoned officer, practical and respected, the kind of man who inspired quiet confidence in his crews. He had his doubts about intelligence reports, but trusted that London knew more than he did. Rear Admiral Hamilton, leading the covering force further west with his cruisers, shared those doubts. Yet naval tradition left no room for protest. Orders were to be obeyed, not debated. The Admiralty's fear of Tirpitz was greater than the convoy's fear of the enemy they could actually see. For the German side, deception was as effective as torpedoes. The Kriegsmarine maintained elaborate radio traffic, suggesting that Tirpitz and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper were preparing to sail. In truth, mechanical problems and logistical confusion kept them at anchor. But Allied intelligence, listening to fragments of encrypted transmissions, couldn't tell the difference between movement and theater. By the evening of July 4th, the misinterpretation had hardened into certainty. Tirpitz was coming. At that exact hour, 21:23 Greenwich time, the fateful order was transmitted. Convoy PQ-17 is to scatter and proceed to Russian ports. Another signal followed, just as devastating. The cruisers and destroyers were to withdraw westward to meet the supposed German threat. For a few minutes, disbelief filled the airwaves. Some ships asked for confirmation, assuming the message was coded or incomplete. The answer came swiftly, unequivocal. Yes, immediate. Across the Barents Sea, those words changed everything. On board the Ocean Freedom, Captain John Dowding put down his coffee cup and stared at the radio operator as if he'd misheard. "They want us to scatter?" he repeated. The operator nodded. Dowding looked out over the fog-shrouded horizon and said quietly, "Then God help us all." From that moment, the convoy began to unravel. The warships that had formed its shield turned away, their wakes glowing faintly in the midnight light. The merchant ships slowed, uncertain, then one by one began altering course, drifting apart like leaves on a frozen river. Formation, discipline, and shared defense, all gone in an instant. The sea absorbed them, and the silence returned. To the men on deck, it felt like abandonment. They had trusted the escorts the way infantrymen trusted their armor. Without them, the Arctic was limitless and lethal. The fog thickened. Ice drifted against the hulls. In the eerie half-light of the Arctic summer, where darkness never came, they could see their own breath rise into the sky like smoke from an unseen fire. The order to scatter had set them free. Free to die alone, unseen, unheard. In Berlin, the High Command couldn't believe their luck. German radio intercepts quickly revealed the confusion. "The English ships are running away," one officer noted. "They save us the trouble." By dawn, U-boats were already spreading out to intercept. The Luftwaffe began arming bombers along Norway's northern airfields. The hunt was on. The irony was that the Tirpitz herself never left her fjord. She sat motionless in Altafjord, her crew standing by, unaware that her reputation alone had destroyed a convoy without firing a shot. For the men of PQ-17, that reputation had become reality. And as the first day of isolation passed, the Arctic closed in around them. White, silent, endless. Their fates were now their own. The first attacks came before dawn, though in the Arctic summer, dawn was a suggestion rather than a moment. The sky had never gone fully dark. To those aboard the scattered merchantmen, the pale horizon looked almost beautiful, an illusion of safety that vanished with the first howl of engines overhead. From the north came the shapes they had feared for days, German bombers sweeping low across the sea, their underbellies flashing silver, the black crosses on their wings clear even through the fog. The first wave of Heinkel He-111s released torpedoes that skimmed the waves like metallic sharks, leaving white wakes that cut straight toward the convoy's broken fragments. Each ship fought alone. Anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, their shells bursting orange against the mist. The concussion tore at eardrums. The recoil of every gun vibrated through decks already slick with ice. On the Navarino, a torpedo struck midships. The blast threw men into the freezing air, the heat followed instantly by cold that clawed the lungs. The Pancraft went next, broken in half by a direct hit. Her crew watched their ship disappear in minutes. Then the fire took the oil, and the sea itself seemed to burn. To the south, U-boats of Wolfpack Eisteufel, the Ice Devils, closed in. Their periscopes pierced the surface one after another, small black needles against white. Commander Rolf Mützelberg aboard U-203 logged his first sighting. Merchantmen alone, no escort. Easy kill. The Germans could scarcely believe what they saw. A convoy meant to sail as a fortress was now an archipelago of panic. They hunted methodically, surfacing to finish off crippled vessels with gunfire. The crews who survived the explosions faced a worse enemy: the water. In the Barents Sea, a man could survive less than 2 minutes before unconsciousness set in. Some ships fought back. The Samuel Chase managed to down one bomber before catching fire herself. Her captain stayed aboard until the flames reached the bridge. Witnesses from a nearby freighter saw him still at his post as the ship rolled under. Others tried to flee toward the pack ice, hoping the floes would hide them from aircraft. But the ice offered no mercy. It crushed hulls like paper. By nightfall, 13 ships were gone. The sea was littered with debris, crates of ammunition, wooden planks, oil drums, and lifeboats half swamped in freezing slush. Survivors remembered the sound above all else. The sea had a voice that night, a mix of wind, engine whine, and distant explosions that never quite stopped. Over radio, fragmented transmissions crackled through static. Under attack, fire spreading, abandoning. Then silence. Some ships tried to regroup, calling each other by coded names. Few answered. Every hour brought a new column of smoke on the horizon, a marker where friends had been. The Luftwaffe's Ju-88 bombers returned in the early hours of July 6th. Without cloud cover, they hunted by sight. Pilots described it as target practice in daylight that never ends. From altitudes low enough to see men on deck, they released bombs that skipped across the water before slamming into hulls. One American sailor later wrote, "You could see the pilot's face before he pulled away. He was young. We all were." By July 7th, PQ-17 had ceased to exist as a formation. Ships that hadn't been sunk drifted alone toward Russia or back toward Iceland, navigating without radio contact or escort. Some reached the ice edge, where they lay hidden in fog for days, engines silent, crews praying not to be found. Others pressed on and vanished entirely, names later listed only as missing, presumed lost. In one of the few intact ships, the Ironclad, the men heard a steady tapping from beneath the hull, ice grinding against steel. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. The second officer noted it in his log. "Feels as though the sea itself is waiting for us." The cold invaded everything. Oil froze in pipes. Bread turned to stone. Men chipped ice from the guns with axes, knowing that if they didn't, the barrels would jam. When the attacks paused, it wasn't mercy. It was exhaustion. Even the Germans had to refuel and rearm, but they had done their work well. In 3 days, 2/3 of the convoy was gone. Admiral Karl Dönitz wrote in his diary, "The Arctic has finished what we began." For those still afloat, there was no sense of victory or defeat, only survival measured minute by minute. Their radios filled with fragments of distress calls, fading one by one into static. Somewhere above the endless daylight, a single British reconnaissance plane sent its final report to London. Convoy scattered, under continuous attack. Situation hopeless. Far away, in the Admiralty war room, that message was received without emotion. The decision had been made. The consequences were now beyond reach. The Arctic, silent and merciless, would take care of the rest. The next morning brought no rescue, only silence, a stillness so complete that even the survivors mistook it for mercy. In truth, it was the pause before the second storm. The German bombers returned at noon, their shadows sweeping like blades over the fog. Some ships were already derelict, engines dead, decks frozen over, crews huddled around signal lamps they dared not light. On the Housatonic, the captain wrote one last entry: "Ice forming on every line. Men too cold to speak." Minutes later, a Ju-88 came out of the mist and dropped its bombs directly into the ship's wake. There was no explosion, just a muffled thud beneath the surface, then the sea swallowing the rest. For others, the ordeal was slower. The Paulus Potter, a Dutch freighter, had been crippled 2 days earlier. Her crew abandoned her when the boilers gave out, leaving the ship adrift. German aircraft spotted the empty hull on July 13th and, not realizing it was deserted, set it ablaze. When Allied rescue ships later found her remains, she was a charred skeleton afloat in an ocean of ice. The men who made it into lifeboats faced a different kind of enemy. The Arctic killed quietly. No gunfire, no drama, just cold. Frostbitten fingers stuck to oar handles, and water froze into the seams of clothing. Many died still sitting upright, eyes open, faces iced into expressions of disbelief. "You could tell who had given up," one survivor recalled. "They stopped talking first, then they just leaned forward and were gone." To the north, a Soviet trawler named Kara received fragments of distress signals from multiple ships. Captain Vasily Krotov tried to reach them, but found the way blocked by dense pack ice and Luftwaffe patrols. He circled for hours, listening to the faint pings of Morse on shortwave before they faded entirely. He wrote in his log that night, "The sea was full of ghosts." By July 10th, the convoy was effectively erased. The remaining merchantmen that had managed to avoid detection limped eastward toward Archangel and Murmansk, engines failing, fuel running out. When the first survivors finally reached Soviet ports, they brought stories no one wanted to hear. Ice on their clothes cracked like glass when they moved. Their faces were burned by wind, not fire. They spoke of ships turned into bonfires against the polar horizon: Pan-Atlantic, Washington, Empire Byron, names that would soon appear on casualty lists read aloud in British churches. In London, the Admiralty clung to fragments of good news. 11 ships had made it through. 11 out of 35. It was enough to call the mission partially successful. But the truth filtered back through telegrams and intercepted German reports. The enemy had not needed Tirpitz at all. The convoy had been destroyed by fear of a ship that never came. The psychological weight of that realization fell hardest on Admiral Dudley Pound. He had acted out of caution, believing he was saving his fleet from annihilation. Instead, he had condemned hundreds of sailors to death. Colleagues later described him as withdrawn, almost hollow. He spoke little after PQ-17, one aide remembered. It was as if he knew he'd broken something that couldn't be repaired. Meanwhile, the survivors who returned found no celebration waiting for them. In Iceland, they were met with silence, hot coffee, and a kind of pity no one voiced aloud. They didn't speak of the men left behind. "You don't talk about ice," one said decades later. "It's still there, waiting." In the weeks that followed, Soviet and British teams scoured the Barents for debris. They found lifeboats packed with frozen bodies, entire crews locked together in death, ropes still tied, eyes open to the endless daylight. The sea preserved them as if unwilling to let them go. One British rescue officer wrote simply, "It looked like time had stopped." Back in Germany, Admiral Dönitz received word of the destruction with satisfaction, but also surprise. He hadn't expected such complete success. "The sea itself," he wrote, "is the best ally of the submarine." The Kriegsmarine credited the victory to superior coordination and U-boat discipline, but many officers quietly acknowledged the truth. Luck and Allied error had done the work for them. By mid-July, the Arctic was calm again. The wrecks drifted under drifting ice sheets, their names erased from the surface, but written forever in the cold below. In the quiet that followed, it became clear that PQ-17 was not just a naval disaster. It was a lesson in the cost of hesitation, of leadership paralyzed by shadows. For the men who survived, it became a kind of vow. "Never again," one officer swore. "If we die together, not scattered." In the days that followed, the sea itself became the enemy. The temperature dropped below freezing, and the wind rose into a constant shrieking gale that cut through wool, leather, and flesh alike. The men still adrift spoke little. Their breath turned to ice before their lips, their hands locked around oars or ropes they could no longer feel. Salt crusted their faces white, and the endless light made it impossible to tell night from day. The Barents was a mirror of pale steel, dotted with wreckage, the graveyard of Convoy PQ-17. The few lifeboats still afloat drifted aimlessly between floes, their survivors delirious from thirst and cold. Ice formed on the sea's surface, then broke apart in slow, grinding movements that sounded like the groaning of distant ships. Some tried to row toward the imagined glow of Murmansk, but the current carried them north, away from help. Oil from the wrecks spread across the water, sealing corpses in a dark film that shimmered under the Arctic sun. "The sea looked alive," one sailor wrote later, "until you realized the shapes were men." Below the surface, U-boats prowled quietly, listening to the static of broken radios and the faint metallic groans of dying ships. Their commanders had been ordered to cease pursuit. The job was done, but some stayed on station, watching. For them, it was not victory, but ritual, confirmation that the North had claimed another convoy. They surfaced occasionally, scanning the horizon for survivors or signs of Allied warships. There were none. Those who made it to rafts or floating debris faced choices that defied reason. To stay dry meant to starve. To drink the sea meant madness. Some sang to stay awake, voices thin and ragged in the wind. Others prayed. One account from a Soviet fishing vessel describes finding a raft days later with 4 men frozen in place, their hands joined as if in a final salute. None bore names that could be read. Meanwhile, in Murmansk, word of the disaster arrived piecemeal. Soviet radio operators intercepted fragmented Allied transmissions, coordinates, distress calls, broken phrases. The port prepared for mass casualties but had little to send. Every available tug and trawler went north, threading through ice under constant threat of air attack. Most found nothing but wreckage, burned wood, barrels of fuel, and the occasional ship's bell still glinting beneath the waves. In Britain, the public was told only that an Arctic convoy had met heavy opposition. The details were classified. Newspapers praised the courage of our seamen braving the northern route, but the names of the lost were not printed. Only later, when the survivors reached home, did the truth begin to emerge. Whispers first, then testimonies. Letters from widows arrived faster than official explanations. For the crews, survival was no triumph. Many suffered frostbite so severe that limbs were amputated in field hospitals upon arrival. Their bodies healed, but their minds stayed in the ice. Years later, some still woke in the night, hearing phantom engines or the creak of hulls in pressure. The cold had followed them home. Back in London, Admiral Pound faced the consequences of his decision. He had believed he was saving the escort fleet for a greater battle. Instead, he had condemned the convoy to annihilation. Those closest to him described him as haunted, often staring for long stretches at the convoy charts still pinned to the wall. He resigned months later, his health failing. The signal that had doomed PQ-17 was, as he would later admit, the most regrettable order I ever gave. The men who'd been there never blamed him directly, but they never forgave the order either. "We followed it," said one officer years later, "because we believed someone knew what they were doing." But in the Arctic, no one knows anything. The sea decides. By the time the last surviving ships limped into Soviet ports, the Arctic route was already being re-evaluated. New convoys would sail with heavier escort, stronger coordination, and no more orders to scatter. Yet even with these changes, none could forget what the cold had done to PQ-17. The ice had devoured men, steel, and sound alike, leaving only an echo, the faint memory of engines fading beneath the endless white horizon. For those who survived, the war would continue in warmer waters and different skies. But for the Arctic dead, the war never ended. Beneath the ice, their ships lay silent, their holds still filled with tanks, fuel, and letters home that would never be read. The convoy that froze to death remained a warning carved in steel, that even in an age of machines, a single human order could be as deadly as the sea itself. When the news of the disaster finally reached London in full, it came not as a report, but as a reckoning. In the Admiralty's underground war rooms, the maps of the Arctic routes were left untouched for days. The pins marking PQ-17's progress stopped abruptly halfway to Murmansk, frozen in place like the ships they represented. Officers passed through the corridors in silence, aware that the unspoken question hung over every conversation. How could this have happened? Churchill was briefed on the full scale of the losses by July 18th. The Prime Minister listened without interrupting as the figures were read aloud. 24 merchant ships sunk, over 100,000 tons of supplies gone, hundreds of men missing. The word "missing" carried its own cruelty. It meant no graves, no certainty, only the assumption that the Arctic had claimed them. Churchill paced the room and said little, but later in his memoirs he would call PQ-17 one of the most melancholy episodes of the war. The political consequences rippled outward immediately. Stalin, depending on the supplies to sustain the Soviet front, demanded an explanation. Moscow radio accused Britain of abandoning its allies. Messages exchanged between London and Washington carried the same tone, measured outrage mixed with disbelief. The American escort captains who had turned back obeyed their orders, but never forgot the sight of merchant ships vanishing astern, left defenseless under skies already filling with bombers. One of them, Commander Jack Broom, wrote years later, "We were ordered to run west while they ran east." That single decision divided the convoy, the sea, and the conscience of every man who survived it. For the families waiting in England, there was no such clarity. Telegrams began to arrive in small coastal towns. Vessel lost at sea. Presumed dead. The wording was always the same. Mothers folded the papers in silence. Wives left them untouched on kitchen tables. Only much later would they learn the truth from survivors. The images of burning ships. The cold that killed faster than the bombs. The long silence after the last signal faded. Among the crews that reached Soviet ports, exhaustion replaced fear. They had endured days of constant attack, ice thick on their decks, engines half dead, and supplies nearly gone. When Soviet officers came aboard, they found the men too weak to stand. Some had frostbitten faces covered in grease and soot, their eyes sunk deep from lack of sleep. Soviet doctors noted that the survivors looked older than their years, as if the Arctic had aged them in a week. Even after the war ended, the arguments did not. Historians and naval officers debated whether Admiral Pound had panicked, whether intelligence had been misread, or whether any convoy could have survived an encounter with Tirpitz had she actually sailed. The question was never fully answered. What remained undisputed was that the fear of Tirpitz, a ship that never fired a shot during the disaster, had done more damage than her guns ever could. Jack Broom published his memoir, Convoy is to Scatter, in 1954, defending his men and their discipline, but also capturing the quiet rage that had followed him home. "It wasn't the ice or the bombs that broke us," he wrote. "It was the order." The moment that signal came through, the convoy died. Everything afterward was just the sea finishing the job. His book became a testament not only to the courage of the crews, but to the dangers of command decisions made from afar, without sight of the faces those decisions condemned. In Germany, the victory was recorded briefly in the Kriegsmarine's war diary, just a few lines acknowledging that the enemy convoy, PQ-17, was largely destroyed. Admiral Donitz praised his U-boat captains for efficiency, but even he understood that luck and Allied confusion had been decisive. For the sailors who fought in the cold, there was no celebration. "The sea did the killing," one German submariner later said. "We only watched." In Britain, the Admiralty quietly moved to restore confidence. The next convoy, PQ-18, sailed in September under heavier escort and strict orders never to scatter. It suffered losses, but reached Russia intact enough to prove the route could still function. The Arctic convoys continued until the end of the war, supplying the Red Army with tanks, aircraft, and fuel. But for many sailors, PQ-17 marked the point where duty and doubt became indistinguishable. Decades later, divers found the remains of several PQ-17 ships resting upright on the seabed, their hulls perfectly preserved by the cold. Inside, they found sealed crates of supplies still intact, a frozen museum of the mission that had failed. Among the debris lay the ship's bells and rusted compasses, symbols of men who had obeyed orders to the end. To this day, the wrecks remain war graves, protected by international agreement. No one disturbs them. They are left as they were, half buried in ice and silence, a reminder that leadership and fear can be as destructive as any weapon. The Arctic has no need for monuments. It keeps its memories beneath the frost. By the time the last echoes of the tragedy faded from the Arctic winds, the world had already moved on to new fronts, new battles, and new decisions. But for those who had sailed in PQ-17, time never really advanced. The cold had suspended everything: sound, memory, even grief. And the men who came back carried that silence inside them for the rest of their lives. The survivors who reached Archangel were treated with quiet reverence by their Soviet hosts. They were given food, warm clothes, and hot water for the first time in weeks, yet many could barely eat. Doctors described them as half dead from cold and disbelief. Their ships were stripped and repaired as best as possible before being sent back into service, but the men themselves remained broken in ways no engineer could mend. When asked about the convoy, most refused to talk. "It's over," one sailor said simply, "but it isn't done." Back home in Britain, the official inquiry into the disaster stretched across months of evasions and half-truths. The Admiralty's report concluded that the order to scatter had been strategically justified under circumstances then believed to exist. It was language crafted to protect reputations rather than understand failure. Those who had been there, those who had heard the crackle of that radio message in the frozen dark, knew better. They called it what it was: panic given the weight of command. Admiral Dudley Pound did not live to see the end of the war. Weakened by illness and haunted by PQ-17, he resigned within a year of the disaster and died in 1943. His colleagues spoke kindly of him, and the Navy buried him with honor. But even in eulogy, there was an unspoken awareness that one of Britain's most experienced seamen had been undone not by the enemy, but by fear of what the enemy might do. In the Soviet Union, the losses were felt just as deeply. Stalin, who had berated Churchill for the debacle, still demanded the Arctic route remain open. Soviet and Allied ships kept sailing through the Barents, carrying tanks, ammunition, and food through the same deadly corridor. Every convoy that followed sailed through the ghosts of PQ-17, each crew passing over the coordinates where so many had frozen to death. They learned from the mistakes: tighter formations, stronger escort, better coordination. But they also understood that no amount of preparation could erase what had happened that July. The Arctic itself kept the memory. Divers in later decades found the remains of PQ-17's ships lying in neat rows, preserved by cold and salt. The hulls were unbroken, the deck guns still pointing skyward, as though waiting for orders that never came. Inside, personal items lay untouched: boots, photographs, sealed letters addressed to wives who never received them. Even the paint on the hulls had survived. When the divers surfaced, they said the silence below felt like a cathedral. For historians, PQ-17 became more than a naval tragedy. It became a study in the human cost of leadership, how a single decision, made in fear and transmitted over radio waves, could destroy an entire fleet. It showed that in modern war, information could kill as efficiently as any weapon. The Admiralty learned, painfully, that courage in command sometimes meant standing still instead of retreating. The sailors who survived the convoy never called themselves heroes. Many refused medals, insisting that survival was not valor. Yet their endurance left a mark on both navies. Among them were men who later commanded ships in the post-war fleet, men who lectured young officers about the day the Arctic swallowed us. They taught that discipline without understanding could be lethal, and that mercy and leadership were not opposites. Even now, the Arctic remains their monument. Beneath miles of shifting ice and perpetual night, the wrecks of PQ-17 still rest where they fell. The sea holds them perfectly, suspended in cold that stops decay, but not memory. On clear days, when the sun strikes the ice just right, you can sometimes see the outlines of the ships beneath. Long shadows under the water, like scars frozen into the earth itself. They sailed believing they were part of a lifeline between nations. They died believing they were abandoned. Yet in their endurance lies the true measure of courage, not in victory, not even in survival, but in obedience carried out to the end, when every instinct must have screamed to disobey. The Arctic remains quiet now. The wind moves across the empty sea, and somewhere far below, the steel still waits. PQ-17 became a number, then a story, and finally a warning carved into history. A reminder that even the strongest fleets can be destroyed, not by the enemy before them, but by the doubt within. 80 years have passed, yet the name PQ-17 still drifts like a ghost through the corridors of naval history. Every navy that studies convoys, every admiral who weighs risk against duty, knows what those two letters mean. The Arctic convoys were supposed to symbolize unity, the free world sending its strength to an ally under siege. But PQ-17 came to symbolize something else: how fear, once mistaken for prudence, can destroy more surely than the enemy's guns. For the families of the men who never came home, the war ended without closure. There were no bodies to bury, no wrecks to visit, no ceremony that could reach through 1,000 miles of ice. In seaside towns from Liverpool to Halifax, wives and children waited for news that never came. Decades later, when the archives opened and survivors spoke publicly for the first time, they learned how their husbands and fathers had died, not in a single grand battle, but scattered across an indifferent ocean, each one carrying out orders that had already sealed their fate. In the years that followed, the tragedy slowly entered the public record. Historians wrote of Admiral Pound's error under pressure. The Admiralty released fragments of radio logs and coded messages that revealed how confusion, misinterpretation, and fatigue converged in one disastrous hour. The documents showed that the feared German battleship Tirpitz had remained at anchor the entire time, her crew unaware that their mere existence had wiped out a convoy. Survivors were invited to commemorations in the 1970s and 1980s. In Murmansk, Soviet veterans of the Arctic Run met the British and American sailors who had lived through it. They toasted the dead with vodka, their glasses raised toward the Northern Sea. "The ice kept them," one Russian said quietly. "The ice remembers everyone." For those who had seen friends frozen to death, the gesture meant more than any medal. In London, a memorial plaque was finally installed in the National Maritime Museum. It listed not just the ships, but the names of every man known to have sailed on PQ-17. Beneath the list, a single line was engraved: "They obeyed, and they endured." It was simple, factual, and true. Perhaps the only epitaph that fit. Beneath the Arctic, the wrecks remain undisturbed. The cold water has preserved them better than any graveyard could. Submersible footage taken in recent years shows hulls upright on the seabed, masts still rising through darkness. Cargo holds packed with trucks and tanks still bear stenciled markings in English and Russian. The instruments on their bridges remain frozen mid-reading. It is as though time itself stopped at the moment of the last order, scatter, and never resumed. For naval scholars, PQ-17 became a case study in the chain of command, how hesitation and miscommunication can cascade into catastrophe. For sailors, it became a legend whispered with respect. In every fleet that followed, commanders taught the story as a warning that courage is not just found in action, but sometimes in defiance of panic. Today, the Arctic route no longer carries convoys, but research ships and icebreakers still pass over the same coordinates. Their radar occasionally picks up the faint echoes of steel below, sonar outlines shaped like ships that once braved the world's deadliest sea. The sailors aboard those modern vessels often pause, knowing what lies beneath. They look out into the cold, and for a moment, history feels close enough to touch. In the end, the tragedy of PQ-17 was not just the loss of ships or men. It was the reminder that war, for all its machinery and planning, remains bound to the frailty of human judgment. A single decision, made in fear and carried by radio waves across the ice, had ended hundreds of lives. And yet, from that ruin, lessons were carved. Lessons that reshaped how fleets would fight and how leaders would decide. Somewhere under that endless expanse of ice, the convoy still moves. The currents shift the wrecks slowly, carrying them east toward the Russian coast, as if they are still trying to reach Murmansk. In that movement lies their endurance, frozen, silent, and unbroken. They were told to scatter, and they did. But their story remains gathered, held together by the cold sea that claimed them.